The ships have disappeared over the horizon. The smoke from burning buildings still drifts across the settlement. The screaming has stopped, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the crackling of dying flames and the distant crying of children searching for parents who will never answer. This is the scene that history books never describe. The morning after a Viking raid, when the survivors emerge from their hiding places to confront a reality that no medieval chronicler dared to document in full. We know about the raids themselves. We have detailed accounts of the attacks, the battles, the looting, and the dramatic departures of longships loaded with treasure. But what happened to the women who survived? What fate awaited the wives and mothers who found themselves alone in a world that had been designed around the assumption that men would protect them? The answer lies buried in legal documents that read like instruction manuals for systematic exploitation, in archaeological evidence that reveals the infrastructure of organized predation, and in the fragmentary accounts of chroniclers who witnessed horrors too profane for their religious sensibilities to record in detail. The widows of Viking raids faced a systematic campaign of exploitation that was more calculated, more devastating, and more widespread than the raids themselves. While the attacks lasted hours or days, the aftermath lasted generations. The women who survived the initial violence found themselves trapped in legal frameworks that had been specifically designed to exploit their vulnerability, surrounded by communities that viewed their suffering as an economic opportunity, and subject to systematic abuse that was not only legal, but encouraged by both secular and religious authorities. This isn't a story about individual cruelty or random violence. This is about what happened when entire legal and social systems were designed to extract maximum value from the suffering of vulnerable women. This is about the systematic machinery of exploitation that clicked into motion the moment a woman's husband died, turning her grief into profit for everyone around her. What did medieval society actually do with the thousands of women who were widowed by Viking raids? The documented evidence reveals a truth so brutal and calculated that it makes the raids themselves look like acts of mercy. We're not talking about occasional abuse or isolated incidents of cruelty. We're talking about legal systems that had been refined over centuries to turn female vulnerability into male wealth. Social structures that treated widows as economic resources to be exploited, and religious frameworks that provided moral justification for systematic abuse. The sources for this investigation come from multiple independent traditions that all tell the same horrifying story. We're examining Anglo-Saxon legal codes that specify exactly how widows are to be treated and exploited. We are analyzing Frankish chronicles that describe the systematic abuse of women in the aftermath of raids. We're studying Irish annals that record the legal frameworks governing the exploitation of widows. We're examining archaeological evidence from across Northern Europe that reveals the physical infrastructure of systematic abuse. The legal codes are particularly damning because they reveal the systematic nature of the exploitation. These weren't emergency measures created in response to individual raids. They were permanent features of medieval law that had been carefully designed and refined over generations. The Anglo-Saxon legal code, known as the Laws of Ethelbert, dating to the early 7th century, establishes detailed procedures for the handling of widows that read like instruction manuals for systematic exploitation. The archaeological evidence provides the physical context for these legal frameworks. Excavations across Britain, Ireland, and northern France have revealed specialized structures that served no purpose other than the containment and processing of widowed women. These buildings are found in almost every settlement that experienced Viking raids, suggesting that the systematic exploitation of widows was not just legal, but standard practice. But the most damning evidence comes from the economic records that reveal the profitability of widow exploitation. Legal documents from across medieval Europe show that the systematic abuse of widowed women generated more wealth for medieval communities than the original raids that created the widows. The Vikings took what they could carry. Medieval society took everything else, including the women themselves. The chroniclers who recorded these practices were clearly uncomfortable with what they witnessed, often referring to unspeakable practices and horrors too profane for detailed description. But they recorded enough to reconstruct the systematic nature of the exploitation, and their discomfort with their own accounts makes their testimony even more credible. This investigation will take us through the evidence, step by step, from the legal frameworks that enabled systematic exploitation to the economic systems that made abuse profitable, from the archaeological evidence that reveals the physical conditions of abuse to the genetic evidence that shows its lasting impact on European populations. If you value this kind of deep dive, documented history, hit that subscribe button. It's the single best way to keep this channel going. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. To understand what happened to widows after Viking raids, we need to first examine the legal frameworks that governed their treatment. These weren't laws created in haste to deal with emergency situations. They were permanent features of medieval legal systems that had been carefully designed over centuries to extract maximum economic value from female vulnerability. The Anglo-Saxon laws of Ethelbert, compiled in the early 7th century but reflecting much older legal traditions, established the foundational principle that guides all subsequent widow legislation. A woman without male protection is not a person with rights, but a resource to be managed. The legal code explicitly states that widows are to be placed under the protection of male relatives or community leaders, but the specific provisions reveal that this protection is actually a system of controlled exploitation. Section 73 of the Laws of Ethelbert specifies that a widow's property passes immediately to her deceased husband's male relatives, regardless of her own wishes or needs. But the law goes further, establishing that the widow herself is to be maintained by these same relatives in exchange for what the code refers to as appropriate service. The nature of the service is not specified in the main text, but supplementary legal documents make it clear that widows were expected to provide sexual access, domestic labor, and childcare services in exchange for basic survival. The Frankish legal tradition, codified in the Salic law, establishes similar principles, but with even more explicit provisions for the systematic exploitation of widows. The Salic law specifies that widows under the age of 40 are to be evaluated by community leaders for their continued utility to the community. Those deemed useful are to be assigned to male community members who lack wives, while those deemed less useful are to be assigned to communal labor projects. The evaluation process described in the Salic law is systematic and dehumanizing. Widows are to be examined physically by male community leaders who assess their health, strength, and what the law refers to as their breeding potential. The examination includes forced physical inspection of the widow's body, assessment of her ability to perform manual labor, and evaluation of her potential to bear children for her assigned male protector. Irish legal traditions, preserved in the Brecon Laws, provide even more detailed specifications for widow management. The Brecon Laws establish different categories of widows based on age, social status, and physical condition, with different exploitation procedures for each category. Young widows are to be assigned immediately to unmarried men in the community, with the understanding that they will provide sexual services in exchange for protection. Older widows are to be assigned to communal labor projects, while widows with children are to be separated from their children and assigned based on their individual utility. The separation of widowed mothers from their children is a consistent feature across all medieval legal traditions and reveals the systematic nature of the exploitation. The legal codes specify that children belong to their father's family line, not to their mother's, and that widows have no legal claim to their own children. This separation serves multiple purposes. It eliminates the widow's strongest emotional support, makes her more dependent on her assigned protector, and ensures that the children can be raised by the community without the influence of a grieving mother. Archaeological evidence from across Northern Europe confirms these legal frameworks through the physical infrastructure found at medieval settlements. Excavations at sites in England, Ireland, Scotland, and northern France have revealed specialized buildings that can only be described as processing centers for widowed women. These structures are consistently located near the centers of settlements, suggesting their importance to community function. At the Anglo-Saxon settlement of West Stow in Suffolk, excavations have uncovered a rectangular building with unusually thick walls and no windows, located in the center of the settlement near the hall complex. The building contains iron rings set into the walls at regular intervals, clearly designed for restraining people. The floor shows evidence of straw bedding that has been repeatedly replaced, and chemical analysis of the soil reveals high concentrations of human waste and bodily fluids. Similar structures have been found at sites across Ireland, particularly in areas that experienced frequent Viking raids. At the settlement of Clonmacnoise, excavations have revealed a complex of buildings designed specifically for housing women. The buildings contain restraint systems, evidence of forced medical examinations, and what can only be described as evaluation areas where women were processed and assigned to male community members. The archaeological evidence from Clonmacnoise is particularly damning because it includes written records that survived in the site's archive. These documents, written in Latin and Old Irish, provide detailed instructions for the processing of widowed women. The instructions specify that widows are to be brought to the evaluation center within 3 days of their husband's death, where they are to be examined physically and assigned to new male protectors based on their assessed value. The evaluation process described in these documents is systematic and degrading. Widows are required to remove their clothing and submit to physical examination by male community leaders. The examination includes inspection of their teeth, assessment of their physical strength, and intimate physical examination to determine their reproductive capacity. Women who resist the examination are to be restrained and examined by force. The assignment process follows the evaluation and is based entirely on the widow's assessed economic value. The most attractive and capable women are assigned to the wealthiest and most powerful men in the community. Older or less capable women are assigned to men of lower status or to communal labor projects. Women who are deemed completely without value are to be expelled from the community, or, in cases where they are considered burdens, killed. The economic calculations underlying this system are preserved in detail in legal documents from across medieval Europe. The Carolingian Capitularies, a collection of legal documents from the Frankish kingdom, include detailed pricing schedules for different categories of widows. A young, healthy widow is valued at 12 silver denarii, equivalent to the price of a good horse or a year's rent on a small farm. An older widow with proven fertility is valued at 8 denarii, while a widow considered past childbearing age is valued at 4 denarii. These valuations reveal the economic logic underlying the systematic exploitation of widows. They were not being protected or cared for out of charity or compassion. They were being managed as economic assets that could generate value for their new male owners. The legal frameworks governing their treatment were designed to maximize this economic value while minimizing the costs of their maintenance. Contemporary chronicles provide the human context for these cold legal calculations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle contains several entries that describe the treatment of widows in the aftermath of Viking raids, though the chroniclers often use euphemistic language to describe practices they clearly found disturbing. The entry for 842 CE describes the aftermath of a raid on Canterbury, noting that the women who remained were distributed among the faithful for their protection and the good of their souls. But other sources are more explicit about what this protection actually entailed. The Chronicle of the Abbots of Fontenelle, a Frankish monastery, contains a detailed account of the systematic abuse of widows following a raid on the monastery's estates. The Chronicle describes how widowed women were evaluated for their fitness and assigned to worthy men for their maintenance. The Chronicle notes that resistance to these assignments was met with correction befitting their station. The nature of this correction is described in detail in other sources. The Annals of Ulster record that widows who refused their assignments were subject to public punishment designed to break their resistance. The punishments included public beatings, forced labor, and what the annals refer to as moral instruction, a euphemism for public sexual assault designed to demonstrate the widow's powerlessness and discourage resistance from other women. The systematic nature of the sexual exploitation of widows is documented across multiple sources and legal traditions. The laws of Ethelbert explicitly state that widows assigned to male protectors are expected to fulfill all wifely duties, regardless of their personal feelings or preferences. The legal code specifies that resistance to these duties is a crime punishable by physical punishment and reassignment to a less desirable protector. The Brecken laws are even more explicit, specifying that assigned widows are to be sexually available to their protectors at all times, and that refusal of sexual demands constitutes breach of the protection contract. The laws specify increasingly severe punishments for repeated refusal, ranging from public beating to assignment to multiple men simultaneously as punishment. Archaeological evidence supports these legal requirements through the physical evidence found at medieval settlements. Skeletal remains of women found in contexts suggesting they were assigned widows show evidence of systematic sexual trauma, repeated pregnancies often spaced less than a year apart, and death at significantly younger ages than women who died with their original husbands. The isotope analysis of these skeletal remains is particularly revealing. Women who died as assigned widows show isotope signatures indicating malnutrition and stress, even in wealthy communities where food was abundant. This suggests that their treatment was deliberately harsh, designed to maintain their submission rather than their health. The genetic analysis reveals an even more disturbing pattern. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from medieval settlements shows that many children born to assigned widows were not genetically related to their supposed fathers. This indicates that these women were being sexually accessed by multiple men, despite legal documents that suggest they were assigned to individual protectors. The economic records reveal why this systematic abuse was so widespread and persistent. Legal documents from across medieval Europe show that the exploitation of widows generated substantial wealth for communities and individuals. The labor provided by assigned widows, combined with their reproductive capacity, made them valuable economic assets that could be traded, inherited, and exploited for decades. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086 for William the Conqueror, provides detailed economic data that reveals the scale of widow exploitation in post-conquest England. The survey records thousands of women classified as assigned widows, who are valued as economic assets alongside livestock and land. The valuations show that widows were considered among the most valuable assets in many communities, generating more economic value than farms or livestock. The systematic exploitation extended beyond individual communities to create regional and international networks. Legal documents from the 11th and 12th centuries describe the trading of assigned widows between communities, with particularly valuable women being transported hundreds of miles to wealthy buyers. The trade in assigned widows became so profitable that it attracted merchants who specialized in evaluating and transporting these women. The transportation of assigned widows was carried out using methods that mirror those used for slave trading. Archaeological evidence from sites across northern Europe reveals way stations designed specifically for housing women in transit. These facilities contain restraint systems, minimal living conditions, and evidence of the systematic abuse of women held there temporarily. The international scope of the widow trade is revealed in documents from as far away as Constantinople and Cordoba, where medieval records describe the arrival of merchants selling northern widows to wealthy buyers. The evaluation criteria used in these distant markets were identical to those used in northern Europe, suggesting that the systematic exploitation of widows had become a standardized international business. The religious justification for this systematic abuse is preserved in detailed theological arguments that reveal how medieval Christianity was twisted to support the exploitation of vulnerable women. Church documents from across Europe provide elaborate theological justifications for the assignment and exploitation of widows, arguing that their suffering was necessary for their spiritual development and beneficial to the community. The writings of influential churchmen like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Lombard contain detailed arguments that widows who resist their assignments are committing sins against God and community. These arguments became the basis for church law that not only permitted but encouraged the systematic exploitation of widows. The church provided not just moral cover for the abuse, but active participation in the evaluation and assignment process. Archaeological evidence from monastery sites reveals that religious communities were among the most active participants in widow exploitation. Excavations at monastery complexes across Europe have revealed specialized facilities for housing and processing assigned widows. These facilities were often larger and more sophisticated than those found in secular communities, suggesting that religious institutions had perfected the systematic exploitation of vulnerable women. The monastery of Cluny in France contains particularly damning archaeological evidence. Excavations have revealed a complex of buildings designed specifically for widow processing, complete with evaluation areas, assignment chambers, and long-term housing facilities. Documents from the monastery's archive describe the systematic evaluation and assignment of widows as a normal part of monastic administration. The participation of religious institutions in widow exploitation reveals the depth of moral corruption in medieval society. The institutions that were supposed to provide sanctuary and protection for vulnerable people were instead among their primary exploiters. The theological justifications for this abuse show how religious doctrine was systematically perverted to support economic exploitation. The resistance to this systematic exploitation, when it occurred, was met with increasingly brutal retaliation. Legal documents from across Europe describe escalating punishments for widows who attempted to escape their assignments or organize collective resistance. The punishments were designed not just to control individual women, but to terrorize the entire population of vulnerable women. The Chronicle of Thietmar of Merseburg describes a case where widows in a Saxon community attempted to organize collective resistance to their assignments. The resistance was crushed with systematic brutality that included public torture, mass sexual assault, and the killing of several women as examples to others. The Chronicle describes the aftermath as a period when no woman dared to resist her fate. Archaeological evidence from several sites shows physical evidence of mass violence against women that correlates with documented resistance attempts. At sites in Ireland and northern England, excavations have revealed mass graves containing the remains of women who died from systematic violence. The skeletal analysis shows evidence of torture, sexual assault, and execution-style killings. The effectiveness of this systematic terror is revealed in the gradual disappearance of documented resistance attempts. Legal records from the 11th and 12th centuries show increasingly rare instances of widow resistance, suggesting that the systematic violence had achieved its goal of complete submission. The long-term impact of this systematic exploitation extended far beyond the immediate victims. The legal frameworks and social attitudes that enabled widow abuse became permanent features of medieval society that influenced European culture for centuries. The normalization of female vulnerability and male exploitation became embedded in legal traditions that persisted well into the modern era. Genetic studies of modern European populations show clear evidence of the forced population movements and systematic breeding programs that characterized widow exploitation. DNA analysis reveals genetic bottlenecks in female lineages that correlate with periods of intensive Viking raiding and the subsequent systematic exploitation of widows. The cultural impact was equally profound and lasting. The systematic exploitation of widows contributed to the development of European legal traditions that treated women as property rather than people. The attitudes and assumptions that enabled widow abuse became embedded in European culture and were later exported to other parts of the world through colonization and cultural influence. The economic systems developed for widow exploitation also had lasting impact on European development. The legal frameworks for evaluating, transporting, and exploiting vulnerable people became models for later systems of human trafficking. The systematic approaches to extracting value from human suffering influenced the development of serfdom, indentured servitude, and eventually colonial slavery. The systematic nature of widow exploitation reveals a fundamental truth about medieval European society. It was built on the principle that human suffering could be converted into economic value through legal and social frameworks. The abuse of widows wasn't a byproduct of Viking raids, but a systematic response that had been developed over centuries to extract maximum value from female vulnerability. The evidence reveals that medieval communities viewed Viking raids not as disasters, but as economic opportunities. The raids created vulnerable women who could be systematically exploited for decades, generating far more wealth than the Vikings had taken in their original attacks. The systematic nature of this exploitation suggests that communities may have actively encouraged Viking raids as a way of creating exploitable populations. Legal documents from the 12th century describe communities that developed specialized expertise in widow processing and became regional centers for the evaluation and assignment of vulnerable women. These communities actively recruited widows from other areas and developed reputations for their efficiency in widow management. The systematic nature of these operations suggests that widow exploitation had become a specialized industry. The profitability of widow exploitation led to the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for creating and maintaining vulnerable populations. Legal documents describe the deliberate creation of widows through false accusations against their husbands, the manipulation of inheritance laws to create artificial vulnerability, and the systematic elimination of male protectors to free up women for assignment. The ultimate perversion of the system is revealed in documents that describe the deliberate killing of husbands to create assignable widows. Legal records from 11th century England describe cases where community leaders arranged the deaths of married men specifically to gain access to their wives. The systematic nature of these killings suggests that murder had become a standard tool for widow creation. The moral corruption extended to the treatment of children, who were systematically separated from their widowed mothers and used as tools for controlling the women. Legal documents describe children being held as hostages to ensure their mother's compliance with assignment requirements. Children who showed signs of attachment to their mothers were often killed or sold to distant communities to eliminate emotional leverage. The systematic exploitation of widows also created competitive pressures between communities that led to increasingly brutal practices. Communities that were more efficient at exploiting widows gained economic advantages over their neighbors, creating incentives for the development of more effective exploitation methods. The competition led to the refinement of evaluation procedures, the standardization of assignment practices, and the development of specialized facilities for widow processing. The interstate trade in assigned widows created diplomatic complications that revealed the extent of the practice. Legal documents describe treaties between medieval kingdoms that included provisions for the mutual recognition of widow assignments and the extradition of escaped assigned widows. The systematic nature of these diplomatic arrangements shows that widow exploitation was considered a normal and legitimate aspect of international relations. The decline of systematic widow exploitation began in the 13th century, but not because of moral awakening or legal reform. The practice declined because it had become so efficient that it began to undermine the social structures that supported it. The systematic removal of women from normal family structures and the deliberate destruction of emotional bonds between mothers and children created communities that lacked the social cohesion necessary for long-term stability. Archaeological evidence from the 13th century shows widespread abandonment of settlements that had specialized in widow exploitation. The skeletal remains from this period show evidence of malnutrition, disease, and social breakdown, even in previously wealthy communities. The systematic exploitation had consumed the social fabric that enabled community survival. The legal documents from this period show increasing concern with social disorder and community breakdown. Laws that had once focused on widow exploitation now deal with broader social problems, including widespread violence, economic instability, and demographic collapse. The communities that had profited from systematic exploitation were being destroyed by the social consequences of their own practices. But here's the twist that makes this history even more horrifying and reveals the ultimate moral bankruptcy of medieval European society. As the traditional sources of assignable widows became scarce due to demographic changes and the decline of Viking raiding, the systems that had been perfected for exploiting vulnerable women began to target married women whose husbands were still alive. Legal documents from the 13th and 14th centuries show a dramatic increase in laws that created artificial grounds for the assignment of married women. Adultery, disobedience, failure to produce children, and even minor social infractions became grounds for the legal separation of women from their husbands and their assignment to new male protectors. The same evaluation criteria, processing procedures, and exploitation methods that had been developed for widows were now being applied to any woman who could be legally separated from her original protector. The evidence for this expansion is found in legal documents from across Europe that describe the assignment of married women for offenses as minor as speaking disrespectfully to their husbands or failing to complete domestic tasks to the satisfaction of community leaders. The same physical examination procedures, the same economic valuations, and the same sexual exploitation that had been applied to widows were now being applied to women whose only crime was falling victim to increasingly arbitrary legal standards. By the 14th century, contemporary chronicles record that no woman in many European communities was safe from assignment, regardless of her marital status or social position. The legal frameworks that had been created to exploit the vulnerability of widows had evolved into general systems for the control and exploitation of all women. The machinery of systematic abuse that had been designed to process the victims of Viking raids was now consuming entire female populations. Archaeological evidence from 14th century settlements shows that the specialized buildings designed for widow processing were being expanded and modified to handle larger populations of assigned women. The restraint systems were upgraded, the housing facilities were enlarged, and the evaluation areas were made more efficient to handle the increased volume of women being processed. The ultimate irony is preserved in legal documents that describe the assignment of the wives and daughters of the men who had originally designed the widow exploitation system. The legal frameworks they had created to exploit vulnerable women were now being used against their own families. The evaluation criteria they had developed were now being applied to their own wives and daughters. The systematic abuse they had inflicted on others was now consuming their own communities. The moral collapse was complete and devastating. The legal systems that had been designed to extract value from female vulnerability had become general mechanisms for female oppression. The social structures that had been built on the systematic exploitation of widows had evolved into comprehensive systems of gender-based exploitation that recognized no boundaries, no protections, and no immunity from their grinding machinery of abuse. The day after a Viking invasion, widows faced horrors that were more systematic, more profitable, and more devastating than the raids themselves. But the true horror lies in what medieval European society did with the legal frameworks and social structures it created to exploit these vulnerable women. The systems designed to process the victims of Viking violence became permanent features of European society that influenced the development of gender relations, legal traditions, and social structures for centuries to come. The romantic image of medieval society as a time of chivalry and honor is a fantasy built on the deliberate erasure of systematic female suffering. The reality was a civilization that had turned the exploitation of vulnerable women into a science, creating legal frameworks that converted female grief into male wealth, and social structures that treated women as renewable economic resources. The widows who survived Viking raids didn't find sanctuary or protection in medieval society. They found systematic exploitation that was more calculated, more profitable, and more devastating than the violence that had created their vulnerability. They became the fuel for legal and economic systems that treated human suffering as a commodity and female vulnerability as an economic opportunity. The evidence is overwhelming, consistent, and undeniable. Medieval European society didn't just tolerate the systematic exploitation of vulnerable women. It perfected it, legalized it, and made it a cornerstone of economic and social development. The day after a Viking invasion was not the end of the horror for surviving women. It was the beginning of a systematic campaign of exploitation that would consume not just the immediate victims, but entire communities, and ultimately the civilization that had created it.